It is obviously a wonderful time for me to be able to come and talk about the book as well as my newer research. And in fact, in the book, I'm going to try to explore ideas that cross between both projects. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. So I would like to begin with an incident that a northern Nigerian Christian pastor Inusa Samaila, related to a white missionary. Sometime in the 1930s, Inusa, who had for several years been preaching the gospel in WARA land in central Nigeria, and I'm going to put up a map soon, sometime in the 30s he won an entire village for Christ. This is him writing about this. They sent for me to come, he wrote. On my arrival, they told me that since their brother Jiko, a convert, had returned to them, they now fully understand the word of God and were repenting from their sins. Now, they said, they wanted to get rid of all their idols. That day was spent in destroying idols of all descriptions, from stones to pots to altars. From morning right on to evening, we destroyed the devil's work. That night we rejoiced greatly and returned to Karu, praising God. Because of what happened, I sent to Minna to let the missionaries know, and Mr. F.X. Stanley came to investigate and see if these things were so. Of course, it was found to be absolutely true. However, there was one blind man who had thrown out his idol, but his children replaced it. Apart from this, it was true that all the rest of the chief down, were rejoicing in Christ as Savior. Inusa led this destruction, not as a Muslim, which he had been until he was about 20 years old, but as a Christian evangelist. After this incident, he would not be ordained as a pastor by the Sudan Interior Mission, through whom he had converted, for about 20 years, despite the fact that he appears to have acted in a way the white Christian missionaries might have supported. The destruction of the village gods was thus the work of an indigenous lay Christian seeking to carve out for himself a fiefdom in the bush, only nominally under the watchful eyes of the white missionaries. If the blind man's children had been hoping for their father to have the protection of the old gods and the new, or at least ruin Inusa's reputation in the eyes of the white missionaries, they were surely disappointed. So I want to start with this first map to show you sort of some of these dividing lines. This map is actually
That's right.
That's okay.
This is coming from Inusa's own diaries. I developed this map, and basically the story in this map is that Inusa returned to his home. He was from Dosso in Niger. He traveled between Dosso and Nigeria, and it was in his travels that he first met missionaries in 1911, and then converted from Islam to Christianity, and then became a preacher in this place, Karu, which is down here by Ida, in what is considered central Nigeria. But what you can see in this map is that he passes through some of the most important Muslim towns in northern Nigeria, including Sokoto, Gwandu, Birnin, Kebbi. So this is part of my argument that he is creating this fiefdom in central Nigeria, being a stranger in many ways to northern Nigeria itself. He's Zabarma or Zadma or Jarma by ethnicity. It was this power of Christian evangelists to sway entire villages that caught the notice of Muslim emirs in Hausa land. In 1940, after several years of relatively peaceful cooperative medical work between Christian missionaries and the Hausa Fulani emirs, the British colonial authorities reported rumors that emirs were discussing the possibilities of sending, quote, Muslims against among pagans. The purpose of this evangelism is not immediately clear. Were the emirs seeking to compete with white missionaries to convert non-Muslims, or were they responding to the fact that pagans, as Christian converts, had achieved authority among Muslims? The word pagan in English, especially how British colonialists used it, is very vague. So it's difficult to tell from these sources. Nonetheless, the Sudan Interior Mission, Inusa's sponsoring mission, for its part, knowing that these rumors of Muslim anger were out there, celebrated the increasing Hausa literacy among Christian converts from pagan and Muslim communities, as well as their taking monetary collections in churches for quote-unquote foreign missions, which at this time in the 40s mostly meant for the work of Christians from non-Hausa ethnic groups to evangelize in Hausa Muslim communities. And I'll show the next slide, which is again taken from the book. It's a little bit, the story doesn't go exactly with what I've been talking about, but basically this shows the placement of the SIM, or Christian Missionary Leprosarium, right near Kano, and all these dots represent from all the origin places of of leprosy patients who came for Christian missionary care. You can really see that this Christian mission medical institution served as a center point for people from all over northern Nigeria to come, from as far south as here, which is considered the middle belt. What's striking about this are the squares, which is where itinerant evangelists like Inusa took evangelism out beyond the confines of the mission. They, on their own, went to evangelize, and some of the communities that they went to were actually, quote-unquote, pagan Hausa or Malgazawa, who I'll talk about. And I won't say quote-unquote for pagan all the time because the subject of the talk are pagans, so I'm going to use that term, not in a disparaging way, because as you'll come to see, I myself am a pagan, which I'm going to talk about. The scale and pace of competitive mass conversions increased in northern Nigeria from the 1940s onward. In the 1960s, Sir Amadou Bello, the Sultan of Sokoto and the Premier of northern Nigeria, began conducting mass conversion campaigns in Kuta, in the middle of Nigeria, here in the south, in the middle area, to the south of the Muslim territories, and in Adamawa province, which is here in the northeast, lately in the news a lot because of Boko Haram, while Christian evangelists began to hold their feasts of repentance among Maguzawa, the pagan Hausa, who had not converted to Islam in spite of jihad and other forms of Islamization over several years. And the Maguzawa tend to be primarily in Kano, Katsina, and Bauchi emirates. So in these stories, historians of West Africa will recognize a crucial transformation. A line in the political geography of the Western Sudan had been crossed. That is the line between Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, where in northern Nigeria and Niger, where the Fulani and Hausa had established a Sokoto Caliphate, and Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, to the south, where people like the WARA, who Inusa was evangelizing, and other Muslims lived. We clearly see that once the once gradual pace of Islamization, as historians of pre-colonial West Africa describe it, was replaced by a sense of urgency in the 20th century, owing to the impact of colonial-era Christian missions. This evidence proved crucial for the central argument of my book, that Christian missions and conversion shaped Muslim northern Nigerian society and politics in profound ways. But it left me with questions that I couldn't really answer in the book. I could see that pagans, a notoriously old but hazy collective, were important, but were they only so because of their disappearance? I found little actual evidence, as Jean Allman and John Parker cite in their book Tongnam on Ghana, of the modernization of an indigenous religion in northern Nigeria. Yet the word pagan was not gone from Hausa or northern Nigerian discourse. In the course of my own research, when I was asked about my religion and I answered Hindu, Muslims and Christians both would ask if that was paganism, which it is, in a way, right, in that definition. They shared a vague sense of what paganism meant, but they both seemed to share disbelief and skepticism that I could really be a pagan in the flesh and blood. It almost seemed as if one never asked about paganism, and certainly one never told if they were actually a pagan in northern Nigeria. Paganism was not a part of polite conversation in northern Nigeria. I was struck by the idea that the pagan, a figure so prominent in Arab and African Muslim writings in the medieval era, had become a relic, a figment of the imagination in the 21st century. The pagan in Nigeria is an index of competition between religions, but it is also an intellectual category necessary to Nigeria's intense and active history production. As we know, Nigeria is a center, more so in the past, of historical production. But I'll come to that later because I think it's reviving. It is impossible to tell the history of Nigeria without pagans, but it is unclear whether we can say very much about pagans when religious discussions, censuses, and even attending services has become dangerous in northern Nigeria. One really has to be careful now what topics one talks about in places like Kano. The purpose of my talk is twofold: to examine some of the British political practices in which the pagan figured prominently, and then to explore the ideas and images of paganism as they've been constructed and used in the last 50 or so years as part of anti-colonial and post-colonial political projects. So this is how I'm trying to move also from this earlier project that really focuses on colonial-era relationships religious relationships in northern Nigeria into my next project that will span past the colonial period in India and past the colonial period in West Africa, and also to make a foray into intellectual history. As early as 1929, when the Igbo political leader Nnamdi Azikiwe, then a student in the US going by the name of Ben, wrote scholarly articles, he sought to educate Western readers on the varied political systems of pre-colonial Nigeria, describing on the one hand the inseparability of church and state in Yorubaland, the politics of who he called the Turk, Usman Dan Fodio, on the other, and to describe the third major arm of Nigeria's trinity, the Igbo Obi's laissez-faire, even rationalist policies towards Christian missions, with only a warning that he gave to his people against, quote, false religion in which a god had no wife but did have a son, right? A very significant curiosity. Azikiwe narrated African history and politics in terms that were familiar to, yet critical of the colonialists, who argued that Nigerians were not prepared for self-rule, in large part because of their diversity, and also who touted the superiority of Christianity and Islam over paganism. With the first edition of John and Beattie's African Religions and Philosophy in 1969, it is easy to discern a key moment in the articulation of indigenous African religions as true religions. Yet neither historians nor political scientists have tried enough to make sense of the politics of naming, how we got from pagans to indigenous African religions in intellectual discourse. We have not looked closely at our own assumptions in discussing religions in Africa, which Mbiti himself alluded to in the preface to the second edition of his book, in which he states that he consciously shifted from emphasizing African religions as plural to focus more on commonality and the potential unity, if not uniformity, of African religion in the singular. It is my contention that the politics surrounding this shift relate to a broader development in which Africa's pre-colonial religious diversity has been increasingly politicized, often against a backdrop of conflict and violence. I seek to trace the politicization of paganism by discussing how African and some South Asian intellectuals sought to deploy African paganism as emblematic of pluralism that Western imperialists never achieved in Africa. Their uses of Nigeria's pre-colonial history in political projects labeled as democratic are precisely the kinds of intellectual work that I argue Boko Haram is seeking to demolish in its attack on Western education. I argue that it is not Western education writ large, but history very specifically that Boko Haram seeks to erase in part. So first I would like to focus on the catalyst for the intensification of conversion of so-called pagans to world religions. There is little doubt that non-Muslims suffered politically with the advent of British colonialism. The conventional explanation of historians for this increasing disadvantage relates to the disparities of indirect rule in northern Nigeria. In 1901, with the British destruction of Sokoto, came the British promise of non-interference with Islam as a religion and a commitment to put in place Muslim rulers. The limited colonial resources, as well as British fears of further Muslim resistance, help explain the British use of Islamic organization for political expediency. In non-Muslim areas of northern Nigeria, the British tended to rule with a heavier hand. Christian missions were invited to evangelize in these areas and were prohibited from working officially in Muslim areas, so that pagan northern Nigerians could be kept in line or made loyal to the British. Yet some of the stiffest continued resistance to the British occurred in places like Tivland, on the Benue River, which did see Christian conversion. So Christian conversion did not mean compliance, and in fact meant continued truculence in some areas of northern Nigeria. And this is a theme that I'll keep returning to, is Christian truculence, political truculence. Indeed, it could be said that Muslims were more easily adapted to British rule in northern Nigeria than pagans in some areas. Many non-Muslims seeking political appointments were actually made to convert to Islam, which missionaries complained about. So the typical explanation is that in these middle belt areas, as it's called today, there was this intense conversion that was aided by the British, whether it was to Christianity or Islam. I think historians have overstated the argument that British policies against allowing Christian missions, or allowing Christian missions in pagan areas only, and British favoritism towards Muslim political authorities exacerbated religious tensions. In other words, in my book, I argue there's much too much emphasis on what the British did. What we need to look at is how Nigerians were relating to each other. I don't think the religious lines were always clear, that is between pagan, Muslim, and Christian, nor non-religious factors unimportant. For instance, the governor of Nigeria, Hugh Clifford, in 1920 expressed fears about appointing Muslim rulers in places like Plateau or Bauchi that were not Muslim or were Muslim but anti-Sokoto, that is, dissident Muslims. And in fact, Murray Last has been writing more about the non-Sokoto Muslims, right? These Muslims that didn't accept the jihad in the 19th century. So Clifford was fairly critical of British political authorities in the Muslim Emirates as taking too heavy a hand. So there was disagreement and inconsistency within British circles and practices. Another factor was that in areas like the Jos Plateau, where tin mining was the main industry, commercial business interests were allowed to act as political institutions by the British. In 1932, the resident of Bauchi, E.J. Arnett, argued that, quote, miners and other Europeans having nothing whatever to do with the administration were the best agents for bringing undeveloped pagan areas to a peaceable and commercial frame of mind. Religious identity as pagans was never allowed to develop in preference for making them workers, homegrown or migrant, for the mines. What becomes clear from this kind of evidence is that more significant than the strengthening of religious tensions by the British was the weakening of political institutions and identities. Religious identities in pagan areas was not immediately strong or obvious. In the 1940s, however, religious identity became stronger for non-Muslim northern Nigerians as Christians, and they still remained a minority, and I'll talk about statistics. Christian missions were the major catalyst for the politicization of an anti-Muslim and anti-Fulani, Hausa Fulani, although I think we shouldn't automatically put those ethnicities together, anti-Fulani Nigerian sensibility. Jonathan Mamu Ayuba, Niels Kasfeld, and Moses Oshonu have given the Middle Belt movement the greatest amount of attention in their work. But it rarely registers in many political histories of northern Nigeria, in part because the British authorities studiously avoided recognizing the Middle Belt politics, right? A politics that stretched across this area, particularly that this map doesn't show well the confluence of the Benue and Niger rivers. The Northern Non-Muslim League was founded in 1949 under the leadership of Pastor David Lott and gained support from the two most active Christian missionary associations in northern Nigeria, the Sudan United Mission and the Sudan Interior Mission. As Ayuba notes, the leaders of the political movement were Christian clergy and Bible school graduates. Inusa's account discussed earlier, opening the talk, accords well as a prehistorical development to the formation of this political party. With recognized political leaders. Mass conversions had as much to do with the recognition of a religious leader as a political leader than they had to do with individual belief. So my argument is that these evangelists created the following that then pushed for a political party along a Christian northern Nigerian line. And there were parallel and interconnected movements for the recognition and the ordination of men like David Lott and Inusa by white missionaries and by political authorities. So there were two simultaneous things happening, one in the religious realm, one in the political realm, and these sort of coincided in the 1940s. The internal tensions between these kinds of leaders have not received as much attention. The scholars recognize that some northern Nigerian Christians joined the conservative Muslim political party headed by Ahmadu Bello, the Northern People's Congress, while others stayed within a distinct non-Muslim middle belt political party. So in other words, their politics were very complicated, some by ethnicity, by ethno-linguistic ties, some by religious ties, some by even secular ties that had to do more with their intellectual outlook. But the main point is that to a large degree, Christian northern Nigerians were the first to prioritize religious identity over ethnic differences, because there were so many ethnic groups among Middle Belt communities. And their evangelistic zeal drove Muslim politicians to intensify their religious activism. So in my book, I really try to connect for the first time that Christian nationalism influenced Muslim nationalism in northern Nigeria, not the other way around. What is also clear is that the Middle Belt organizations never meant to represent the non-Muslims who lived in Muslim areas, who were the ones I studied. I focus much more on the Hausa land than I do on the Middle Belt. I have shown that missions among Muslims inaugurated and exacerbated the movement of Muslims among pagans, as I showed you the map of Inusa's travels, and of pagans among Muslims. In these mixed areas, political parties never captured complex political interests, right? These cosmopolitan areas never had political parties that cut across religious lines. So these cosmopolitan areas, too, as I'll talk about, weren't only in cities like Kano, they were also in rural areas like where mission stations existed, that there were Muslims and Christians who lived in those areas. And so by the time of party politics, there was very little representation that cut across those lines. One final argument about the situation of non-Muslims in the colonial mindset. White Christian missionaries tended to uphold Muslim Hausa culture. As we have gained more understanding of the proliferation of Christian missions in Muslim Hausa land, whether in Nigeria or Niger, with less priority placed on numbers of conversion and more on cultural exchange, we see that Hausa culture and language had a major impact on the character of northern Nigerian and Nigerian Christianity. In the area of Bible translation, to take one example that Barbara Cooper has highlighted, the leader of the Hausa Bible translation team, Walter Miller, was the head of the Anglican mission at Zaria and a noted Hausaphile. He commented in the 1930s that the language of religion in Hausa, influenced heavily by Arabic and Islam, made Christian translation so much easier than it was with pagans anywhere in Africa. He began Hausa language work in the early 1900s, actually in 1899, with Hausa pilgrims to Mecca he met in Tripoli, and commented, "How accurate was the work done with those delightful pilgrims to Mecca who taught me so much in those days, and who little thought that on their long journey from Nigeria to Mecca via the Sahara, they were going to be pioneering and giving the greatest book in the world to their own people." We have been relieved of one difficulty which has been so severe to those translating the Bible into more primitive pagan languages. Examples of words one would just mention are love, sin, holiness, hope, confession, and of course many more. We find already that our little Christian church is using many of these words with a new and different significance to their Muslim brothers. Non-Muslims had to live within the ambit of Muslim northern Nigerians, their language, and their ideas. According to a 1958 British report, and I'll put the statistics up here, the population of northern Nigeria, the religious statistics of northern Nigeria stood at this. Nearly 4.3 million animists or pagans, 11.3 million Muslims, and only 547,000 Christians. This may help to explain why African Christians took up aggressive evangelism. Many northern Nigerian converts from paganism to Christianity, including ones who were Hausa by ethnicity but also non-Hausa, considered themselves to be more pious and more reformist in their religious discourse than Muslims. The British acknowledged the lack of legal or political checks on proselytism by Muslims and Christians, and even in this report from 1958, which was on minorities in northern Nigeria, argued that there was intolerance on both sides, Muslim northern Nigerians as well as Christian northern Nigerians. And yet the British offered no protection for pagans in courts or anywhere else. The problem of laws to govern religion and conversion especially exposed itself quite early to the British. The British understood that a family of a convert stood to suffer if they weren't able to determine at what age the person had converted, if it was a man, who were his wives at that point, and there were many recantations, particularly from Christianity to Islam, and so at that point the families actually inherited nothing. There's clearly much shared between Christians and Muslims in northern Nigeria, and their urgency to convert pagans to their camp was mutually creative and competitive. Nonetheless, it is striking that 2 years before Nigerian independence, only so many Northerners called themselves practitioners of indigenous religions. The presence of Christians has without question grown in northern Nigeria today, although we have a problem with getting statistics, and helps explain the fear of Muslim northern Nigerians after independence. So, in other words, even if Christian northern Nigerians still are a minority in northern Nigeria today, which I'm not sure they are, if you look at the World Christian Database, it's very much depends on which region you're looking of the north. The fear of Muslims is related to the intensity of evangelism and the rapidity of conversion, more so than actual numbers or even other kinds of behaviors of Christians. After Nigerian independence in 1960, a major catalyst for increased attention to the question of pagans was rural-urban migration and issues surrounding ownership of lands and buildings, particularly those that foreign Christian missions had occupied. Beginning in the early 1970s, the government Nigerianization scheme entailed returning businesses, government functions, and lands to African hands. And northern Nigerian church leaders sought to take control of Christian mission clinics, schools, and hospitals, quite naturally. Northern Nigerian church leaders reported at this time that Maguzawa, the pagan Hausa who resided in deep rural Kano, Katsina, and Zaria and Bauchi, where there were Christian mission stations, were coming to Christianity in thousands. A white missionary remarked on this process. I'm told that a public ceremony is held these pagans make a public confession renouncing all their evil ways. They choose Christianity and make a public confession of faith in Christ in which those changing their religion step forward into a central area. They cast their idols and fetishes and charms into a fire. They publicly state they repent of their paganism. In the 1970s, the Emir of Kano, Ado Bayero, who recently died, called 70 Maguzawa to confirm their conversions, and he reportedly became very angry and demanded they, quote, return to their paganism, and he forbade church building. This is an interesting idea that people should go back to becoming pagans after the colonial period. They answered that he gave permission to build hotels where prostitution, gambling, drinking, and the like were going on, so why should he forbid building a house of worship, an argument that he couldn't really argue with. For those Maguzawa who do not want to become Christians, the missionary wrote, they had to move further and further into the rural areas to find a pagan village. Nigerianization, this policy, thus allowed rural dwellers a unique moment to acquire some of the only pieces of modern development in northern Nigeria, a region, of course, that the British had left notoriously underdeveloped. So this picture shows a Maguzawa Christian community in rural Kano from the 1940s. And this community was created entirely by the activities of a Hausa Christian evangelist. But I think it illustrates the character of rural Christianity that you find in Kano state today, in Bauchi, in a lot of these heavily, these states that we think of as majority Muslim. In the process of material accumulation, because that was a huge part of why these rural dwellers took such a strong religious stance, they might not have otherwise, the Christian discourse of pagans began to change. That is, quote unquote, the converts to Christianity did not any longer see that Christianity should erase paganism, but instead began to emphasize that pagans, quote unquote, were ancestors who had been unknowing about the world, that they were innocents whom Muslim governments, pre-colonial Muslim governments, had shunned. So the critique had turned from pagan religious practices to Muslim authorities, who were seen to be urbane, corrupt, and immoral, nothing more than tax collectors. So in other words, this argument was now being made, these Muslim reformers, these jihadists, never let us into the fold of Islam, and never allowed us education and the other benefits that came with Islam to them. The change highlighted a developmentalist rhetoric of the 1970s, rather than a punitive one, and a very strong anti-government critique. This kind of softened discourse was not unknown among Christian missionaries of the colonial period, but now in the post-colonial period, it had the potential to change the electoral map, which was the fear of the Emir of Kano when he interviewed these pagans. He had, even though he had no electoral significance, he did deliver votes from Kano to the ruling political party. Rural dwellers were emboldened by the processes of Nigerianization of mission institutions in the 1970s, and their views as Christian converts from non-Muslim areas who claimed that their forefathers had been naked, undressed, and unschooled by Muslims relied on historical accounts that since the days of the Sokoto Caliphate, Muslim rule was self-interested, elitist, and ethnocentric. There were critiques of this kind of Christian rhetoric from within the fold of Christianity itself. John Garba, a notable northern Nigerian convert from Islam to Christianity who was born in 1916, attended CMS Anglican School in Zaria. He was sent there by his father, a Muslim from Borno, who worked in the Kano Native Administration in the 1920s and 30s. Garba went on to earn a prestigious Newfield Scholarship, study at the London School of Economics, and work for the Nigerian government in Jeddah with the Pilgrimage Board and for the World Bank. He also served as Nigerian ambassador to Italy and the US. Garba's reminiscences show the non-sectarian character of the first Nigerian national government, And he was actually chosen for certain positions because he stood between religions, that is, between Islam and Christianity. Though educated by Anglican missionaries, he was quite critical of religious politicization in Nigeria, especially by Christians. He was the Nigerian ambassador to Italy during the Biafran crisis and denounced the politicization of the crisis as a religious one, arguing that this was Catholic fanatics who had done it, both within Italy and in the rest of the world. He also wrote of the use by Colonel Ojukwu, the Biafran leader, of Catholicism when it benefited his cause, which we can clearly see was an implicit defense of the Nigerian government side in the Civil War. Yet he sought to school Christian northern Nigerians by explaining the Hausa Muslim sensibility of religious difference as being more sophisticated than Christians thought. He clarified that education was the key difference between the Hausa Muslim notion of differences between infidel, kafir, and pagan, arna. The former was an apostate, while the latter was ignorant or innocent, if you will, of any blame until he or she had been educated. By Garba's time, instruction on religious education, Islamic and Christian, was already mandated by government in northern Nigeria, but he blamed Christians for ignorance of Islam and found Muslims to be far more educated about religion, including Christianity and paganism. Garba's message was to Christian northern Nigerians that Christian education was not sufficient, and in this there is an implicit critique of what the missionaries brought to Christian northern Nigerians. He's basically saying that missionaries didn't teach Christian northern Nigerians enough about Islam. So there was an anti-missionary message in his advice as well. But he believed that education was the only answer for Nigerians of different religions to live together. West African paganism featured in another anti-colonial, anti-Christian missionary politics, and this is where I'm coming to the Ahmadiyya. The Ahmadiyya Indian Muslim missionaries used the term pagan quite consistently and consciously from their first entry into Africa, and their first entry was actually into West Africa, which makes them interesting. Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia from the early 1920s. As far as Muslims who were consciously missionaries go, it seems that these Indians came to 20th century West Africa before Arabs. They were driven by their own politics at home, as missionaries, and I mean that. They were driven by their own politics at home, notably a competition for converts that was running between Christian missionaries, Hindus, and Muslims in India. In the newspaper Muslim Outlook based in Lahore in 1927, Muslim Indians made clear their interests in West Africa, quoting the British resident in Nigeria, Ormsby Gore, on the relative civilization of Muslim and pagan West Africans, and so they carried a lengthy piece about how British saw West African Muslims. Islam had brought civilization to barbaric tribes and converted isolated pagan groups into organized nations. This was the British view. Yet the Ahmadi Indian missionary Hakim, working in the Gold Coast in the 1920s, did not favor this view, so much as point out in the same newspaper that the British and their Christian missionaries had done nothing for Africa. He wrote that in the Gold Coast, the greater part of the people in the colony are pagans, and next to that are Christians who are divided into Wesleyan, Methodists, Roman Catholics, English Church, etc. The Christians have a network of their propagandic work, both spread all over the country and have established their day and Sunday schools for boys and girls almost everywhere, and it's through these schools that they are gaining membership in their church. Otherwise, Christianity has nothing in it to appeal to the native. These boys and girls are Christians in name only and are quite ignorant of Christian dogmas and teachings. You will be astonished to hear if I were to tell you their funny beliefs about Jesus. One day a lady said during my open-air lecture that Jesus had fallen down from the sky and not born to any woman. Back to this question of Jesus' divinity, which of course is the central one between Christians and Muslims. Like Garba, many decades later, there is here a critique of Christian missionary education, but especially as it is misrepresenting matters important to Muslims. That is the question of Jesus. But Indians, whether Muslims or Hindus, saw paganism in fundamentally different terms than white Christian missionaries and colonial officials saw it. In 1936, in the midst of competitive Hindu-Muslim evangelism in India, a Hindu writer sought to claim the label of pagan as the label of underdogs. This is a quote. Many of us think that the word Hindu means thief, slave, or pagan, kafir, and hence we should never tolerate this name being given us. It goes without saying that the foreign invaders, and he means Muslims, who defeated and subdued us began to call us slaves and kafirs. But does it necessarily follow that we too should begin to hate our name? If the word Hindu came to signify a kafir or thief, it was not because there was something inherently wrong with the word itself, but because those who bore the name had fallen and become slaves. Whether or not they fought with their enemies tooth and nail, whether they came off victorious in the struggle or were defeated and subdued by their foes, they were our ancestors. We cannot deny being their progeny, nor can we discard the appellation of Hindu. While the quotation does not reflect directly on Africa, it helps shed light on the politics of the label pagan as it was being debated in other multi-religious contexts. Pagan meant political victim. Indians and Pakistanis after partition in 1947 saw paganism as not an obscure phenomenon or even something exotic, but as the source of a cultural insecurity because of colonialism that the post-colonial psyche had to deal with. Right? They were not seeing an erasure here, but actually that paganism was something that peoples in the colonized world had to come to terms with. To take a Hindu view of West Africa in 1955, a representation of the recently set up Indian Commission in West Africa toured northern Nigeria and commented that throughout his trip, the Muslim northern Nigerians were highly critical of India as an anti-Muslim and anti-Christian nation. Mostly, he thought, because of British influence. He wrote about how the British officials tried to keep him away from politically savvy Africans. All the people that I saw, except those who were called pagans and lived in the plateau, wore Muslim beards on long, flowing Arab robes. The Indians always felt that the West Africans dressed as Arabs, the West African Muslims, and the Indians were fairly anti-Arab. How servile they were was evident from the way they greeted an Englishman, end quote. South Asians saw West Africa, especially Ghana with Nkrumah at the head, as hopeful as having the best chance for keeping African culture alive, as opposed to East or South Africa, where white and Indian settlement had been greater. In these Indians' minds, Muslim Nigerians compared as less independent than pagan Nigerians or Ghanaians. Indians also seemed to dislike what they saw as the Arab imprint on African Muslim culture. Now, not to mention, of course, some Arabs are North Africans. For the Muslim Ahmadiyya after 1947, so in a Muslim Indian view, their interest changed from proving the multiracial and egalitarian character of Islam to proving Islam's tolerance for all religions as compared to Western Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam as it was changing in Pakistan and in the Arab world, which South Asian Muslims tended to find alien. The spiritual head of the Ahmadiyya, Hazrat Mirza Nasir Ahmed, visited Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia, Ivory Coast, Liberia, and Sierra Leone in 1970. When in Lagos, he enjoined all men, Muslims, non-Muslims, pagans, to be tolerant with one another, just after the Biafran War had ended. He emphasized the Ahmadi position on jihad as being of the pen and not of the sword, and John Hanson has written about this, and suggested to Nigerian audiences that West Africa was the best place for this vision of the Ahmadi help. And this is a quote that in his address that he gave in Lagos. "The accounts of your country and people we received and read in the 1920s fired our imagination, and I, for one, have ever longed to see things for myself and meet the people whose hospitality and kindly interest we have enjoyed since those days. Finding myself here, I find a dream fulfilled. I have become aware of your history, of your culturally rich past." Unlike Christian missionaries, the Ahmadi leader made explicit reference to African history. In his writings, he admired Usman Dan Fodio as a rightful reformer who employed his pen, a reading of pre-colonial African history that did not necessarily accord with pagan views of the jihad. But it is the case that Dan Fodio's regime had stopped short of converting all Pagans, which African historians have sought to show. During this visit, General Yakubu Gowon, the military head of Nigeria, in welcoming the Ahmadiyya leader, took the opportunity to note religious cooperation during the Civil War and criticized foreign religious rabble-rousers. The Civil War was the dream of an individual and his foreign backers, and here he's referring to Ojukwu. Thankfully, Nigerians did not listen to overseas religious propaganda. Throughout West Africa, the Pakistani heard messages of pluralism. Liberian President Tubman recalled that the founding fathers of his nation believed in God, but that their concept of him was not narrow, and he urged all religious sects to prepare and formulate a plan that will resolve political ideologies that believe in world domination. And of course, the Cold War context here is extremely important. In Sierra Leone, one newspaper took the occasion of the Ahmadi head's visit to write, quote, "Unless the West paused in its craze for physical power and material domination, it was bound to destroy itself as foretold by the Holy Quran and the earlier scriptures." After leaving Freetown, the Mirza went to Spain to meet with General Franco, who had his own visions of control, and then returned to Pakistan, and in his Friday sermon expressed his gratitude to Allah for the way he was received by the heads of the states, chiefs of Africa, and people of these countries, Ahmadis, Christians, and pagans, and the love that he gave them and the love that he received from them in return. The Ahmadiyya were seen to copy some aspects of Western missionary work, White Christian missionaries often said this, and one writing in 1936 about the Ahmadiyya in Lagos reported that the Ahmadis were holding watch night services and choirs, just like Christian missionaries did. However, the white missionary view of African history was fundamentally negative. The same white reporter wrote that Africans had no historical background. The tribe, quote, from which he comes has no written historical records of the past. And his fathers never had any desire to know what was happening in the world in the days before they were born. And this is from an Anglican missionary who worked in Zaria. The Ahmadiyya missionary, on the other hand, drew attention to the Nigerians' ancient cults when he wrote about his reception in Nigeria. Quote, the hearts of Ahmadis and Christians and pagans, even atheists and devotees of ancient cults, have been enthralled at the spectacle of Islam they see in the shape of Ahmadiyya. This is my personal observation. In Nigeria, I came across an assembly of over 50,000, majority of whom were non-Muslims, break into dance at my site. Friends from many parts, men and women, had traveled for miles and stood packed in rows with one Ahmadi in each row and 6 to 7 non-Muslims arranged in rows deep behind them. I could pick out non-Muslims because of their dance. This is how they express their joy. Both men and women utter a cry and then waltz into a dance, which you can see is some form of exoticism. What impelled them to break into a happy jaunt at the sight of an unknown stranger? It was the glimpse of the beautiful face of the Holy Prophet they saw in the compassionate attitude of Ahmadiyya. I won't be off mark if I say they saw the reflection of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. They found it in the frame of Ahmadiyya that had bewitched them. It was because of this that they bubbled over with joy at the sight of the representative of Ahmadiyya. And he's referring here to the non-Ahmadis. It is precisely the equivalency that he makes between the Ahmadi leadership himself and the Prophet that many mainstream Muslims cite as the heresy of the Ahmadiyya. Yet it is impossible to deny that the Ahmadiyya have been influenced by Hindus and Christians. But I would argue that there is even here an embrace of paganism in the consciously interreligious pacifist politics of the Ahmadiyya, not to mention their privileging of pre-colonial religious history, whether in Africa or in India. Rather than focus on religious debates about what if the Ahmadiyya constitute heresy, which by some measure they do, what is interesting to think about is how West Africa influenced South Asian religionists. We know that West African pluralism provided a special model for thinkers like Edward Blyden, but far less attention has been paid to African religious influences on non-Christians and those not of the black diaspora. Diasporic Indians and Pakistanis, particularly Muslims who were effectively displaced by partition and discriminated against by Muslim religious nationalists, found a special religious cosmopolitanism in West Africa. In the immediate post-colonial era, pagans continued to be relevant for this small but politically minded and influential sect whose presence is much wider than its numerical strength. I mean, you can see there are many, many pictures of the Ahmadiyya head with political leaders. This is one of the kinds of pictures that he had reproduced, but meeting political leaders in all countries. It is not, however, the case that the Ahmadiyya did not want to convert and reform these so-called pagans. For example, the sect certainly enforced measures such as strict sex separation that Africans in countries like Liberia found altogether strange, and they commented on it. But Ahmadiyya pacifism could not stand as a stark contrast to Pakistani Islamism without claiming pagan Africans as brothers and sisters. Yet, it is striking that the term pagan has grown over the late 19th and 20th centuries into a lack of specificity, into a generalized concept in colonial divisions of pagan and Muslim provinces, in the evangelical urgency of Islam and Christianity, and in the political campaigning of Christian and Muslim northern Nigerians. Colonial policies and religious reformism have homogenized pagan into a universal catch-all for heterodox practices, and in the process obscured these practices' historicity. Even in trying to complement or venerate this historicity in the post-colonial period, the Ahmadiyya could only comprehend it as an openness and tolerance. Were African traditional religions open and tolerant? Probably not all, but this perception has grown not only because of scholarly historicism, but also popular historicism. It is significant that foreign observers in the post-colonial era have relied on this image, and it is an image that some politically minded Nigerians want to promote. However, their politics has been more to claim the pluralism of non-Muslims to denounce Muslims than it has been to claim that a wider pluralism existed in northern Nigeria. That is, past pluralism of pagans is often part of a defensive Christian apologetics, rather than an admission that Christianity too has radicalized followers in the region. Can history be used to forge a path forward for all Nigerians? I'm not sure, but at the very least we should look at the ways in which history is being used or not used. So this is more like a summary of the points that I've made. And, you know, I think I've made clear that Christian radicalization has been a factor in northern Nigeria, often an unseen factor. And evangelical communities, campaigns have made northern Nigerian communities incredibly mixed, and yet there's no legal protection for people who are converts or people who don't want to be evangelized. And this situation dates back to the colonial era. Boko Haram's desire to destroy Western education specifically, it seems to me, must be seen as a direct attack on the project of historicism, secular historicism, in Nigeria, in which Nigeria used to be a leader on the African continent. We can actually say probably there are many Nigerians in diaspora, Nigerian intellectuals in diaspora, because the climate in Nigeria itself has changed. Study of Nigerian history invariably leads one to conclude that there existed pluralistic currents and cross-religious exchange. Even the history of the jihad shows this. So it is salient that Boko Haram does not merely want a caliphate, it wants a timeless one. It does not model itself on Don Fodio's caliphate. This vision even ignores Islamic historicism and law, which is based on historical precedent. It is an illogical and reactionary movement that deserves no rationalization, but it is well to point out that it seeks to exploit lawlessness, especially in the areas of rights of non-Muslims and Muslims, which were never provided for under the British, the exemplars of the most liberal empire in world history. In quotes. British policies did not bring pluralism to northern Nigeria, but encouraged the creation of fiefdoms created by religious iconoclasts, Christian and Muslim. The Nigerian government has done no better by censoring and exterminating religious critics rather than reforming its excesses. I do believe that Nigerians today are paying for their past pluralism. It is my hope that lessons can be learned from the particularisms of pre-colonial religious practices, lessons that can be brought to bear not only within Nigeria, but beyond in countries like India and Pakistan that are experiencing their own religious radicalization. Certainly, African pluralisms deserve to be raised to the level of universal discourse and practice in the face of the utter failure of Western secularism in today's fractured world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions. Questions?
In my readings, I'm a Southern Africanist, and also do quite a bit of reading during this early period of Christianization of Southern Africa. And one of the terms that is constantly used is heathenism or heathens. And I rarely run across the word pagan in reference to local religions. Is that not the case as well at all, or does it come into play at all?
I think if you take northern Nigeria or Sudan, I think the British really took up this word in part because that's what Muslims had used. But I think also that the translations of these words, for example, that you have in Hausa language, kafir and arna is the non-Arabic term and for non-Muslims. And Hausa-speaking people do distinguish between different kinds of African traditional practices. The word kafiranchi, or practices that are kafir, would be used not for random, for religions that don't. For practices that don't intersect with Islam at all, but maybe, for example, a kind of sacrifice that isn't done properly. So it would be rather a reformist sort of term as opposed to one that completely alien practices would be put into a different category. But there is a variegated category, and I think the British, as you're suggesting, use different words in different in different places. And in many places they've adopted the language of religious difference that existed in those places. Because clearly in northern Nigeria there was a pre-colonial literature, actually writings to draw on, to take some of these terms, and the Christians were doing the same. The Christian missionaries were doing the same, right? They were studying written texts or taking oral texts of Hausa language to use those words that one found in Hausa language. I mean, the missionaries and the British officials saw Hausa speaking or northern Nigerians as very literary people. And so they took a lot of their terms for local practices.
Are, shall we say, to make things simple, pagan converts, relatively recent pagan converts, more likely to embrace, shall we say, Adventist or millennial forms of Christianity, or do they normally gravitate on what might be called the establishment, more orthodox type of Christianity?
This is a really good question. I mean, first I should say that the kind of Christianity that the missions, the biggest missions in northern Nigeria brought were they were not the established churches. The Sudan Interior Mission was a North American mission that was fundamentalist, that included people from Pentecostal backgrounds. So the kind of Christianity that they already had were anti-Anglican, anti-Catholic. So they have been, younger ones in those churches have gravitated towards Pentecostalism. But they do they separate themselves from the southern Nigerian churches that may be sort of the African initiated churches with more, like the Aladora, for example. So they are really torn between being northern Nigerian Christians and not wanting to ally with southern Nigerian Christians, and I sort of talk about this in the book. But they are much more conservative in their outlook about how much African tradition should be allowed into the church. There were lots of debates about should drumming be allowed in the church. Alcohol is very strictly forbidden. And so they're much more reformist in their character than some of, in southern Nigeria you might find people the first people in the family were Anglican or Methodist, and then only recently their Pentecostalism or charismatic Christianity has grown. To me it seems there is less of a spectrum in northern Nigerian Christianity to a liberal Christianity that is liberal on policies such as drinking, where divorce is very, very frowned upon. And that is partially a reaction that divorce is so common among Muslims in northern Nigeria. So a lot of their religious tendencies, as Christian tendencies, are pegged to what's happening in Islam as opposed to what's happening in other forms of Christianity.
Thanks for your very comprehensive and really a new perspective on Christianity in northern Nigeria. I was wondering, I thought that the British actually, that the CMS did establish some schools for girls, and it seemed to be specifically for elite Fulani Muslim, and I wonder, and it wasn't the purpose of the schools was not really to convert, but to create, to maintain this elite notion that there existed a sort of ruling, class, and I'm wondering if you see any resonance of that now, because we do have a very conservative type of Islam among the Hausa Fulani elite, and this in a sense is very different from if we link it to if we come to the present and look at Boko Haram, they certainly do not really they're not part of that older elite. So I'm wondering if even the you touched on the sort of difference in the way in which Boko Haram express, even reject, the sort of, elite form of and more orthodox form of Islam among the ruling Fulani elite. I wonder if you could touch on that some more, because I do know that there were some of these same females, Hausa elite, who were educated. They in fact became very important in some of the brotherhoods and were really, they did a lot for the education of Muslim women in the 1940s and so on, with some of the Tijaniya. And you didn't touch on some of the older established, Muslim brotherhoods that became very important and continue to function. So I wonder how does your, that complexity in the northern Nigeria case, if you dealt with that in your book, I'd like to look at it, but if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so the Walter Miller, who I made reference to, established in Zaria first. His first mission station was within the city walls, the Muslim city wall, the Muslim core of Zaria. It was not in
outside.
Yeah, right, where there are a lot of the non-Muslim populations. He was allowed, for various reasons, to establish there, and then only in 1929 he moved outside. But he did have a school that was intended for, that the royal family of Zaria also attended, members of the royal family.
Right.
And so that, and many women educationalists were produced out of that group, and in fact, he was, why when I refer to him about Hausa language, Hausa having, Hausa Islam having a lot of impact on Northern Nigerian Christianity, it was really through him, and he definitely saw that Hausa, there should be an effort to convert Hausa to Christianity, so that, because he was an he saw them as ethnically superior to other groups. And so he always focused on making marriages, I talk about this in the book, making marriages between Hausa and Fulani converts from Islam to Christianity, that he would be very careful in how he architected these families. In between 1940 and 1965, I think you can see that there was a fairly close relationship between people like Amadou Bello, Tafawa Balewa, and some of these elite Christians. John Garba was employed by these very people. And part of this, I think, has to do with that sort of interest in Western education that could be married with Islamic education, because I think, someone like Amadou Bello would be seen very unfavorably by Boko Haram, right? Because they embraced both. And he was a very modern sort of person, at least in the way he articulated his Islamic politics. If we talk about modern Muslims' politics in late colonial, post-colonial Africa, West Africa. I spoke to some of the women who had been in that tradition, with Anglican schools, and they felt very, there was a notable difference in the way the women saw Amadou Bello and Muslim leaders from the way men did. Christian men saw paternalist alliances with these Muslim men, whereas some of these Christian women felt that they had been marginalized because they were not upholding norms of Northern Nigerian respectability, in the sense that one woman recounted about how Amadou Bello wouldn't shake her hand when he visited the women's training center in Kano after she had done so much for women's education in Kano and Katsina and these places. So it seemed like there was a gendered difference in the memory of religious politics from that period. But at the same time, I think elite Muslim women and elite Christian women, and I talk about this in the conclusion, had a sort of shared philanthropic interest, almost as kind of Anana Asmao, a kind of missionary, a missionary impetus towards poor Muslim women and poor Christian women. So what I really focus on is that the class mattered more than religion in that era of Northern Nigerian politics. The shift away was when there was many more critiques of the government, the first Nigerian independent governments, the Biafran War. Bala Yusuf has wrote about the manipulation of religion, particularly after Biafra, and really that people hated Gowon, and also that there was a lot of foreign missionary attempt to influence the situation, right? But I think that, and so they talk about the shift, and I agree with that. I think that you can see this pluralism through even the early years of the Republic. And I think the other point about the Christians is that these Christians who come from the non-Anglican tradition, say the Sudan Interior Mission, ECWA, today they're ECWA, Evangelical Churches of West Africa, they're very critical of these high upper class Christians, these Anglican Hausa and Fulani, who maintain their own separate ethnic organizations. Hausa Fulani Christian ethnic organization as distinct from the rest of northern Nigerian Christians. And so there are these ethnic politics within the Christian community. Although that Hausa Fulani community is now, it's mostly elderly women. Many of their daughters are single. John Garba actually in his autobiography writes about the problem of, he calls it infertility, but basically a barrenness, a barrenness in the Hausa Christian community that they haven't really grown and they've disappeared. And part of what the ECWA people say is that these people felt too good to marry. They wouldn't marry their children to other people across ethnicity.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you for bringing up this topic, but for your perspective on it. I learned more, although I need to learn more about it, but I learned more about the relationship between India and Africa. I've heard bits and pieces before, but I'm very curious about it. But I have two main questions. Yes, I mean, besides that to me was a really awakening. But I have two questions having to do with the Muslims in Nigeria, both in that period and currently. First question, do you see a difference between the various obediences in Muslims, traditional obediences from the Arab world, in the Sufis, the Sunnis, and so forth? Is there a difference in attitude and perspective and the way they reacted to others, including the pagans in Nigeria, then and now? The second question related to that is, if there was a distinction, a different approach among these people, which one, if any, relates to Boko Haram today? And then the last question is, what do you make of ethnic lines among the Muslim communities in Nigeria then? Did they matter, or were they irrelevant?
So the first question about Sufis and non-Sufis.
Right.
One of the things that came up to me in the sources, but this wasn't my main topic, is that there was a lot of tension between the Tijaniya and the Qadiriya in northern Nigeria developing from the 20s and 30s. And the people like Amadou Bello had to confront that problem at the same time that they had to confront the problem of northern Nigerians converting to Christianity. So in some ways, I think the sectarian problems within Muslim northern Nigeria couldn't be seen apart from a general defection away from the Qadiriya at this time, between, say, 1925 and 1950 or 60. And so I think that one of the things that Amadou Bello did, for example, in converting new people to Islam, was to make less important these distinctions between the various Sufi paths. Which I think also led far too easily into critiques of Sufism generally by people like the Isala, these reformist Islamist groups, after, the 70s. Or even other reformist tendencies like the May Tetsine riots, the riots, the leader who in the 80s. So in some ways, I mean, speaking from what I know best, which is less about the various problems between the brotherhoods, that the traditional Sufi brotherhoods had to confront challenges that were from within Islam as well as externally, and their reaction was in some ways to go for new converts into. You could see these conversion campaigns as equally about converting people who were pagans or Christians, as well as in response to the loss of following to the Qadriyya specifically. So does that answer your questions? And then you said in response to how they felt about pagans, right? Is that?
Right, whether there was a different approach between them. In some countries, the Sufi faction, to use that term loosely, did not approach other communities in the same way. And they maintain differences in how they deal with each other and how they deal with others beyond their faith, whether they're Christians or non-Christian but non-Muslim, pagans, for instance. So I was wondering, I don't know about in Nigeria, and I was wondering whether you see those differences in approach there, then, and also which, if any, of those different Muslim groups could be said to have led to Boko Haram today, and what would, which faction, if any, would a group like Boko Haram represent among those Muslim groups?
From what I've read about Boko Haram, they make no genealogical relationship with any of these older orders. They're very, very critical of the established Muslims in Borno, as well as in other parts of northern Nigeria. And so, but again, I still think they have a very shallow understanding of Islamic history in northern Nigeria, as well as history in general. I mean, they make no reference, in fact, in the sermons that I've read, but it's not my area, to Don Fodio's reforms, for example. I think if they did, Don Fodio is a very good example. I mean, the first thinking about Don Fodio was that there was no space for pagans, right? There's one side of the literature that says that pagans were enslaved and brought into the ribats and basically used as kind of field hands. But then there's the other part of the literature that's saying there was actually a very structured system by which to collect jizya, poll tax from non-Muslims. And if you look at Jean Boyd and Beverly Mack's work on Nana Asmao, while in her writings she talks about non-Muslim specific non-Muslim practices that Muslim women shouldn't do, the Yantaru, her organizations, they used some of the costumes of the local Bori practices. They emulated the indigenous practices to be able to popularize themselves. So you see actually in practice more closer affinities to appeal to a broader audience, to popularize their ideas, and to bring more people in, or maybe to widen the umbrella of the jihad and to bring more people into it. So I feel like there's competing strands in the literature on even the jihad era, the Sokoto Caliphate era, but from what I've read, these Boko Haram people are not even sort of discussing in depth this kind of history.
But they've always been, even during the Sokoto period, the whole way in which, the Sokoto Caliphate expanded was in fact to integrate, it was to socialize and culturalize non-Hausa Fulani people from those same border areas. The process was never finished. And that, I believe that groups like Boko Haram, in fact, know very well that conflictual history, that outsider, insider, that the elite, versus or pagan versus, Muslim. And I don't think that they're so ignorant of the history. They know very well that it's informed by the whole colonial, and post-colonial transformation. But I think that there have always been that tension in the context of politics and religion, with the beginning of the Sokoto Caliphate. It's never been a perfect fit. Because those slaves that were brought into the Ribat, there was a hierarchy they could pass up. They were integrated. The women, the slave women who were brought into the harems were in fact, their children could, if they had a boy, he could become, a king, he could become an emir, and that we have some of these very prestigious, Muslim Fulani families are descended from those Bayero, I think. So we've always had a process of Islamization, or what I could call, let's say, Islam, northern Fulani Hausa, forceful integration, culturalization of non-Fulani Hausa people. And they did, so it's not surprising that in fact the Bori practices, because if you read Baba of Karo, they were going as children, they all, that was the equalizing. In fact, for women, it was the equalizer.
Right, but that's the sort of thing that I think Boko Haram would completely reject. To engage in practices like Bori, which even in like Heidi Nast's work, where she talks about in the palace, it's maintained.
Yeah.
In the Kondo Palace in the 15th century, you had spaces of non-Muslim practice, right?
Yes.
Although
tolerant.
Right. Whereas this is why I think that in some sense Boko Haram has to deny that history, right? Or
but yes,
that's
politically motivated. I don't think it's because they're ignorant of it. It's because they very well know that history.
Well,
and they're selectively sort of building up a contrast.
What evidence do we have that they've ignored it? That they know it?
Well, that's my analytical, historical, I know the history. And I said the logic of this, and what we'll have to do when we could get inside Boko Haram, we'll find out more of that. But we cannot say that they don't know the history, because that's in fact not really looking at what they're doing and how they're doing it, because they seem to be crazy, but they're not crazy.
Really?
No, they're not. No, they're not.
They're crazy?
No, I do not think they're crazy. And that is not to say I support what they're doing. That's very different. That's very different. I'm a historian. I'm a historian. I've seen a lot of things in history. So I reflect. I'm not just a political scientist, an anthropologist, and I'm not putting down these, but I am a historian.
And I think what I would agree with is that there is a selective use of history, but there's a selective use of history in any of these religious politics.
Yes.
As the people have now, the scholars have now attended more to how Christian northern Nigerians are writing their histories. There is a very selective sort of, we resisted the jihad, we didn't even want to enter into these kinds of relationships with the jihad, etc., etc. The point is that the present the present weighs heavily on these histories.
Oh yes.
Right? I mean, it's very difficult and it's increasingly impossible to excavate them from under the weight of the present.
Yes.
And if you ask me, I think that the way in which Boko Haram has no Muslim even writing about Boko Haram from other parts can explain why Western education is such a problem to them. People draw on the history of opposition to Western education in northern Nigeria, but if you look at the work of Peter Tabendarana, he shows that it was not Muslim emirs who rejected Western education. The British never wanted to really invest in it. So no one has been able to explain why Western education is part of their life. And especially since so many of them are Western educated.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they're ignorant.
If I may ask, among other things, is Boko Haram rejecting quote-unquote Western education or culture and values?
They've attacked schools.
So far you can separate the two.
They're attacking schools. They're attacking children who go to schools. They're attacking schools. But I read today, one of the interesting things is they are going discipline by discipline. In some of their sermons, these disciplines are okay
to study.
These disciplines are not, like geology. Sociology is not okay. Is haram.
Uh-oh.
So they are, and when I say ignorance is to destroy, if you destroy the records or the legacy of something that's even possible to study and debate, if it's not them being ignorant, it's to create ignorance.
Okay.
Right.
Right? It is to create ignorance.
Yeah, that's definitely.
And I do believe these newer generation of Boko Haram people are ignorant.
Yeah.
I think the first leaders had some, you might be able to call them leaders. Their strategies have radically shifted, leading me to believe they're not even the same people. Right? They're really not even the same people who started this in 2000 versus now. The people in 2000 were conscientious objectors to what they had learned in school, against the government, etc., etc. Again, you know, but the other thing I will say, though, what's interesting is that, and I was mentioning this before, I found some sources related to one of these towns that they have now taken from 1910 or 20, where the British had expelled a Sokoto elite from Sokoto and sent them to Adamawa, to the border. And this person had crossed over into Cameroon and created his own sort of fiefdom, and they were raiding non-Muslims' cattle and farms. Very similar to what we see today, because the destruction is one part, the other part is theft of actual property, right? But this goes back to my point that there are fiefdoms, and there may be a collectivity of fiefdoms, as opposed to something called
But
Boko
the
Haram.
Sokoto Caliphate was raiding they were raiding the personnel to build up the caliphate. I'm saying, that the Sokoto Caliphate, that area have always been an expansionist area, and there have always been borders of kind of not built up, borders that have been destroyed to build up the center.
So why not create the Sokoto Caliphate? Why not work in the vein of the Sokoto Caliphate? And now they're doing this in Borno territory, where this didn't exist.
Well, no, what is happening now is total chaos. But the point I differ with you is when you say they didn't know the history, and they were just crazy. And I said, no, they know the history.
And you
And
think
that's
they're
why
not crazy?
Well, there's some crazy, we have a lot of crazy leaders.
There are a lot of crazy Christians.
I gotta go to another meeting at 7. It's a good thing it's right here. Sorry for having to run.
Okay, good to see you.
Good to see you. We met over and we've argued before. So. Great, I love it. I'm gonna pick up the book.
Okay,
I
great.
even use it in my class.
Okay, we'll continue our debate.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I found many things very interesting. I would like you to touch more about the literacy thing among the Hausas. So what actually happened after Nana Asma'u did the wonderful work of, spreading literacy across women, the entire and all that. So what happened after that? Was it the British government that now brought some policies that were not really favorable to expand that? Or was it because of some structural factors or tensions that actually undermine women from continuing from where she stopped?
It's interesting,
But sorry, the second question, so I don't forget. The second question is related to that too. Did you examine during your fieldwork some of the means through which the evangelists used to communicate to the pagans, and whether there was the aspect of Hausa Ajami, Fulfilled Ajami and all that, because it seems there is a link. Recently I found a Holy Bible written in Hausa Ajami, and it was published 10 years ago, but the project started at the time when they were talking about 1930 in Niger. So I'd like to hear more about it.
Okay, so about the first question about schools. After the British conquered the Hausa territories, they really did not want to open a lot of schools. And they really did not want to open a lot of schools that were for non-elites.
Yeah.
So basically, I think you could argue that at least, and they were teaching an Arabic script, and they actually brought scholars from Sudan to do that. And that's been heavily criticized because some of their interpretations are very different, particularly of fiqh and things like that. So I think there were still schools operating, but they were very local level schools. Legacy from the jihad, but there was a lot of violence, for example, in Kano, even before the British came, there was a civil war between 1890, after 1890 basically. And so, after Mohammed Bello's reign in Sokoto, there was a lot of fighting in the Sokoto Caliphate itself, and so there wasn't a lot of upkeep of these institutions, from what I would understand. I think what I could speak to the best is that in the 1930s and 1940s, there was a resurgence of Arabic language schools that in fact the missions participated in, and this is probably when they were disseminating these Bibles, although I'll get to that point. The native administration invested quite a lot in opening Arabic language schools for non-Islamic subjects. Secular, exactly. So there was an expansion during that period, which I think also brought a lot of conversion among non-Muslims, right? The same incentive for Christian missionaries to attend Christian mission school operated for these new schools that were opening under the aegis of the native administration. And so I think you found a renewed popularization of knowledge of Arabic specifically, and then Ajami also, right? So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, but the gender dimension is an interesting part.
Well, so the argument has been made that the emirs were totally supportive of women's education and that the British didn't invest in it. Someone like Elaine Hudson has worked on these Tijaniya circles, study circles that existed for elite women, but they didn't really do the same kinds of missionary work that Nana Asma'u did, like with the Antaru, that I can see. Mainly they were preserving within their own lineages these scholarly traditions.
One hypothesis would be it's a very patriarchal society, and Islam itself encourages that. And the Muslim men would already like their women, their wives to be that educated and highly literate.
So they had this huge problem. They talked about this when they did open girls' schools, which were in 1930, roughly around 1930. They were for elite girls. The elite girls got married much younger than the Talakawa, the commoners. And so they would always have this attrition. Around 12 or 13, the girls would leave the school. And so it would be up to her husband to allow her to continue her education. So, in fact, I think you may see, and it's hard to say, I'm only saying this as a guess, you may see that actually marriage age actually went earlier at that point to get them out of the schools. It might have even been a strategy to marry them at 11, 12, whereas in previous generations it might have been 13, 14 because of the schools. Clearly it was talked about in the sources that it was 11, 12 that these girls were leaving the school. So I think that, if you, like Barbara Cooper's work, these patriarchal practices actually were increased by the colonial interventions as opposed to being reformed by colonialism, and so you can clearly see that would happen that happened in northern Nigeria. This tendency of the elite to protect its privilege, and in fact, with the abolition of slavery, what many of the Muslim elites did in places like Kano, where the slaves didn't have freed slaves' homes and things, they actually married a lot of these girls into their families, and the size of in some ways there would be you could see that there could be a religious impetus or a cultural impetus to actually become a more conservative domestic household if you have these new elements coming in, people from non-Muslim areas, and the idea to convert them to Islam. It's unusual. I haven't seen any sources where people are talking about, say they married a Muslim woman they married a woman who had been a pagan, but they gave her education, right? It was rather that she was marrying into the Muslim household because of abolition. So I think you're right that there there's that tendency. There's also this elite privilege that grew under British colonialism for the House of foreign elite. But at the same time, I think schools did expand at a certain point, so you have to look generationally. Maybe 1920, 1910, 1900 to 1930, a kind of gap, and then 1930 to 1950 or 60, you would probably find more literate Muslim women. And definitely after the declaration of implementation of Sharia, women, because most of my research was conducted after that, Muslim women were really insistent upon going to Islamia schools because they really wanted to understand Sharia on their own and not have it interpreted for them.
So these are Islamic schools? You're not
Yes.
talking about European schools?
No, Islamic schools. Many of them were Western educated and they were holding jobs. They were actually returning to school in the evenings to do Islamic school.
Really?
Yes. Yes, there was between 2000, 2001, I haven't followed this till say 3 years ago, but as of 3 years ago, there was a huge resurgence among women of interest in Islamia schools, as they call them. Not per denomination, not sectarian, but simply to know how to read the Quran in Arabic. Not,
And so the Quran was being taught in Arabic?
yes. So this was a desire to be able to know rights, domestic rights, and I actually would happen quite often that women would say to men, correct men, oh, if she's not covering her hair, she doesn't have to, she's not a Muslim. That's up for, kind of interpreting these new codes, these new laws, or not even laws, but what interpretation should be given in the street. I mean, in popular movements. This was something that I found very commonly, particularly right after the Declaration of Sharia. It seemed to have lessened a little bit. And there's a few people have written about this resurgence of women's interest in Islamic schooling, but particularly in Arabic, not Ajami or something else. And to your second question, I argue that the Bible, the Injil, the New Testament, written in Arabic, was one of the most significant reasons why Muslim rulers, let's say, showed interest in Christian missionaries from the early 20th century. That desire to have those books. So Christian missionaries would bring Arabic Bibles as gifts, which actually went a long way towards easing relationships at the beginning. I found this running through the period of the 1930s and 40s, where Christian missionaries were bringing Bibles written in Arabic. Some of the early texts, they also, passages of the Bible, there were a lot of tracts, pieces of the Bible that they translated, or that they had in Arabic. And there's a Russian scholar, who's worked on the dissemination of Ajami Bibles in the Western Sudan in the 19th century, and argues that this was a very coveted book for scholars. His name is Nikolai Dobromorodin. And so I think, this is where missionaries got the idea that Hausa people were very literate and interested in books. That's a huge part of the book too, where I talk about this kind of thirst for books. Sometimes not even being able to read it, but having.
So this is really for symbolic value.
Sometimes, in fact, I discussed an episode where there is he's a barber, so he probably is involved in some practices that are haram. He's selling Bible touches, people to touch the Bible in the Kano Old City Market. So they're using it for the talismanic quality, some of them are using it for the literary quality. There's probably a lot more research to be done to look at all the ways in which the Muslims use the Bible. I also talk about the way that Christians start using the Quran. Now, Christians don't complain about Muslims using the Bible, because the Bible is actually part of theirs, whereas Muslims in northern Nigeria don't like Christians using the Quran. And I actually, in my section on sources, I talk about this very elderly, senior kind of Christian, Hausa Christian, who came on the radio and talked about his, how he became a Christian, and it was his uncle who was the barber. And people attacked him that he shouldn't even recite any passages from the Quran. That he should not utter any words from the Quran. So I think this power of words, though, I mean, other people have written about this contemporarily, where in Nigeria, in Kaduna or something, you have preaching, Muslim preaching on the one hand, Christian preaching both at the same time, loudspeakers. I mean, it's this power of the word is so intensely used and protected. There's always, Toyin Falala in his book talks about these various episodes where a riot gets started because there is some rumor that a Christian woman used pages of the Quran as toilet paper. But I think just to complete that thought, I think this trading in texts goes back a long way, and this gets to your question. This trading in texts was happening because there was such an intense interest in these different qualities that text could be used.
I think we're going to have to stop here, but we can continue the conversation.
Yes.
But formally, I think we need to